I think we need a whole new generation of creative people to give us the storylines for new outcomes. I kind of borrow from William Burroughs, who was a wonderful, friend to the project and to ecotechnics. And he said, we need a mythology that's appropriate to the space age. And he further said that we're going to judge heroes and villains by their intentions towards the planet.
Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. And when I think about our place in time from a geological perspective, as I am wont to do, one of the premier events of the 20th century of our lifetimes is the creation of Biosphere 2. It was the first legitimate attempt to reproduce the entire living architecture of our planet in a new vesicle. The first cellular division, the first mitosis of the biosphere, at least the first that I'm aware of. This was one of the most impressive things that humans have ever done, an entire living planet inside a building in Tucson, Arizona, or just outside it, actually, in Oracle, Arizona, which for poetic purposes is really vastly better. And while most people are only aware of Biosphere 2 from the mass media smear campaigns that followed the closure of its first experiment, its experiment in closure, sealing 8 human beings, the Biospherians, inside to live together, grow all of their own food, recycle all of their own waste over a period of 2 years, is not only one of the most fascinating, courageous, scientifically bold experiments of all time, but also provided the substrate for some really profound and insightful explorations of human culture and human psychology. As it happens, this is the week that the group that made Biosphere 2, the Institute of Ecotechnics in Santa Fe, hosts their annual conference symposium. And so the time feels right to release the 2 parts of this extraordinary conversation I had with their CEO, Biospherian Mark Nelson, who just published a book called Pushing Our Limits. It's a memoir of his time in Biosphere 2. He's also the author of a book called The Wastewater Gardener, where he has applied the knowledge of closed ecosystems to the project of responsible living on the planet at large. And having walked through the orchard that Mark planted at Synergia Ranch outside of Santa Fe, I can attest to this guy's lasting influence and humble, earthy genius. I really started this show to have conversations like the conversation I'm about to share with you, because stories like Mark's deserve frequent telling. They deserve a much wider audience than the admittedly broad audience they've already received. And as the human species grows up into its responsibility for a more active role in the maintenance and upkeep of Spaceship Earth, it really is crucial that we learn as much as we can from Biosphere 2 and from the globe-trotting band of misfits that created it. One of the most interesting, diverse, eclectic, brilliant, talented, weird, wonderful groups of people I think I've ever encountered. And if I had it my way, this conversation with Mark would not be the last that you're hearing from the Institute of Ecotechnics. But before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out, a note of appreciation to everyone who is supporting this show on Patreon. I'm about to drop a bunch of new exclusives there for supporters at all levels. A gesture of my deep appreciation for you helping me pay the rent and keep the lights on and make this podcast happen. As the self becomes more and more distributed in our digital age, so too does the responsibility of the guru and the patron, a new peer-to-peer network of inspiration and support emerging through our horizontal and synergistic interactions. So join the meta patron, the Swarm patron at patreon.com/Michael Garfield. Help yourself to the already thick vein of gifts there for both patrons and non-patrons alike. And also thanks to everyone who has been rating and reviewing this show on your podcast platforms of choice. It helps a lot. It is, of course, entirely free to do because, after all, time is not money, or at least the ways in which time is money are limited compared to the many, many ways that time is. So you might, as some of the other listeners of this show have, find great benefit in the time you invest in sculpting hyperbolic epithetical praise for future fossils on iTunes or wherever. It is rewarding to participate in the creative process, and that's a really helpful way to do so. So thanks to everybody who has been. We're over 100 reviews. That's awesome. I love you. All right, here is Mark Nelson. Enjoy, and stay tuned for part 2 of this episode coming out next week. Mark Nelson, it's a pleasure to have you on Future Fossils.
Ditto. Am I a future fossil?
I suspect that you are. If you're lucky, you will be, right? Or was it like only 1% of animals that ever lived made it into the fossil record? So,
well, Biosphere 2 triggered my love of wetlands. So now I know I need to die in a wetland, a swamp, because that'll increase the preservation odds.
Well, either that or I think a sandstorm, like desiccation will work, or ice.
I prefer desert. I'm a desert rat too.
Yeah, I think you'd have a better luck of becoming a desert mummy in Santa Fe.
Yeah.
Well, this is a great place actually to open it up. I mean, for anyone who's familiar with you, you are a sort of a in my opinion, a major historical figure akin to the obviously much more media covered Apollo astronauts, because they like put their ass on a rocket and went out into space. But in a way, I think that, you and your colleagues did something much more ambitious, which was to seal yourselves in this container and to participate in a way ahead of its time experiment about, reconstructing the biosphere inside of a building. So, I mean, I guess on the occasion of your book, why don't we talk a little bit about how you got involved with the Institute of Ecotechnics in the first place?
Yeah, well, that'll take us back to Santa Fe. So I was 22 years old, fresh with a Ivy League degree, and a total intention not to have a conventional career because it seemed way too boring. And through a wonderful series of accidental meetings and convergence of interests, let us say, I heard about this group, and they were a theater group, but they were also going back to the land. They had bought some land in New Mexico. That was kind of a thing in the late 60s, was putting into practice, new ideas about how to live together, how to treat the earth better. The environmental movement had just begun. So I rocked up in my brother's VW Bug in October 1969, and I was about 6 months after they had begun work there. And to a New Yorker, first generation Eastern European Jew who had gotten educated in New England, it was like the far side of a Martian desert, not quite as cold, but clearly a ecology that was completely wrecked. And when I heard that the ecotechnic projects, we formed the Institute a couple of years later, but the basic ideas were there, was that everyone would work on ecology. That was kind of our science and environmental aspect. we'd work on Enterprise, and it took me a while to understand that wasn't a job. And we work on theater as an artistic expression. Also, we may come back to that because it's a brilliant way of getting past personality conflicts to other aspects that are more essential that bring people together. So when I heard this program, I was delighted because the idea of picking a career and then basically having weekends and vacations, to fill in the rest of the time seemed really arid to me. And so my colleague, John Allen, who, in addition to everything else, the Harvard MBA, the metallurgical engineer, he's also a poet. He wrote a book called Off the Road, collection of his poems. And, thinking about it, well, it's pretty impressive to stay on the road, to find a road. That takes some doing, especially if it's a road that's not completely socially ordained and you're encouraged to go down the highway. But that going off the road, taking the Whitman metaphor one step further, I think really sums up, when I look back on it, what I was looking for. I was looking for something different. And I had the sense growing up in New York, and maybe I was in a privileged generation that didn't worry so much about careers and putting a bunch of money in a bank account. We were kind of awakened to that there's a whole lot more to living than the infamous American dream and consumerism could possibly ever, even if you won the lottery and became very wealthy, supply. So all of that kind of spoke to me, and so that was the core idea that brought together a group of about 35 people. And about 4 years later, we formally organized as the Institute of Ecotechnics.
And then, so that's like the early 70s, and you don't get the Biosphere until the 90s.
I know. See,
so
and when I give talks now on Biosphere 2, unless I'm really time limited, I like to start with ecotechnics because I think Biosphere 2, and I'm glad you said it, and I'll just say how right you are. Biosphere 2 was seriously ahead of its time. And I think one of the problems, or one of the many problems why people have a hard time understanding it, is it seems to have just literally came out of the ground somehow in poetically appropriate near the town of Oracle, Arizona. But in fact, the core creative people, and John Allen, who I was mentioning, who is one of the founding directors of IE, as I were, we had worked on ecotechnics for over 20 years, by the time we finished and started closure experiments in Biosphere 2. And I just wrote a piece, actually, maybe we go back to it, that there are a lot of sciences and historical contexts of science that, kind of made Biosphere 2 make more sense. But it was a difficult thing to get out through the mass media and to people who were not versed in history of science and whatnot.
There's something about, talking about it as an enclosure. And maybe we're getting ahead of the story here, but we're going to go there anyway. Visiting Synergia Ranch, where this is all located, just south of Santa Fe, you've got, I can't even remember the guy's name, that gorgeous library. And in that library, there's an art book from the 1970s showing the future of space stations. And this is, I'm utterly failing on the author, but this is like now famous, like retro science fiction artwork.
Well, there are two things. One is Gerard O'Neill, who founded the Space Studies Institute.
That's the one.
Was a big visionary, but also Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog. I think in fact, I've never read that, but I'm told that it's a very key book. So there was a whole vogue with space colonies in the late 60s, 70s. There's still sort of a subculture of that. But again, when we talk about Biosphere 2, I think it's so easy to just stamp prototype space colony on Biosphere 2 and call it a day. Mm-hmm. And better if it's a prototype space colony and anything happened that was unexpected, that was a problem, that would be a real problem if you were, in fact, orbiting the Earth or out on a planetary or lunar surface. But that's really just a piece of the story. And again, I was attracted to Synergia Ranch because I loved the idea of having a balanced life and doing three things concurrently, not simultaneously. So similarly, Biosphere 2, the closure was really important. And by the way, for your listeners, because I've had people say, oh, it was invalid because the energy center that supplied the energy was outside Biosphere 2. So maybe we should go back to a definition of a biosphere is it's essentially as close as engineering can do, in Earth's case, how gravity can do, it's materially closed. And that's really important. And, remember all those, junior high school and high school or whatever level, all those cycles that happen on planet Earth. Well, the magic of that is that, the Earth is far more tightly sealed in terms of material, in terms of matter, than Biosphere 2 was. It's incredible how. So that means if life and the biosphere has been continuing for 4 billion years, that means that life has had to figure out, working with the geology and all of that, all of these cycles to keep the important elements from in play, regenerated and made available for new life, for the continuation. Now, okay, before we leave that, informationally open. And what we really, one of the guiding ideas of Biosphere 2 was, let's make a new laboratory and begin the study of comparative biospheres. We only have one biosphere, and, if you're an engineer and a little bit pessimistic, but it's actually a good description, we are currently in this uncontrolled, untethered, unmanaged experiment. Like we are destructive testing a biosphere to see, what the limits are, how much biodiversity can be disappeared, how many people and how many consumers the planet can support. So comparative biospheres. And so, when people dwell on that the purpose of Biosphere 2, or it's the judging of its success or failure, is on the survival of the people inside and whether it worked perfectly, from the get-go, that's really missing. We were not trying to make a model of Biosphere 2, but we were trying to make a mini biosphere incredibly simpler than, the wonder that is the Earth's biosphere, to begin to look at fundamental processes of biospheres. So the information, we thought was maybe going to be the most important thing. And of course, we had the information coming from outside consultants and scientists on what was happening inside Biosphere 2, but the data that we were collecting about, humanity's first shot at making a biospheric laboratory, that information exchange is really important. And the third one is a biosphere is energetically open. So, clearly planet Earth, has supported a biosphere because of the sun. The sun, is burning away, and we're tapping a tiny fraction of that energy.
Wait a minute. You mean we're reliant on something outside of ourselves?
Yeah, I know.
We have been from the beginning, all of us?
Well, this is the thing. What was the song I grew up with? No Man is an Island. I think it was an early Simon and Garfunkel. Yeah, I mean, by the way, this gets into the deeper significance and what, I was lucky enough. I really consider myself, I'm in Santa Fe. I'm not religious, but I'll say blessed, really fortunate to be, among the first 8 people to, have this experience, being the humans cooperating with this mini biosphere, keeping all the machinery going, dependent totally on the life systems in there to keep us healthy. Literally, every breath, every drop of water, every bit of food was because that biosphere was producing life support. And that's Michael, I think you're in California.
Oh, Austin, Texas, yeah.
Oh, Austin, okay. The Santa Fe of Texas. Anyway, this is the reality that most humans have. if they know it, they only know it in a little bit of their, the scientific oriented, cerebrum. And it's a visceral, organic connection that we have. We are metabolically totally, both an evolutionary product of the biosphere and metabolically, and I like to call it, we're in the symphony of the biosphere. Humans are in there with all the other species and the microbes. We should talk about how critical. I mean, if anyone's running the show, it's the microbes. But yeah, and that's not a deprivation. This is not a steel against your unique, contribution and individuality. But it's a reality that actually is quite joyful to realize. You are not an island. Of course, now we know that in fact, even our organism is an ecosystem. But we are totally enmeshed metabolically in the biosphere.
I like telling people that it's like the slime just got more complicated, and like every organism is still basically made out of, full of, and covered in the, that germ layer. And so it's, even if you go up into space, you're going up with your microbiome and all of your, the bacteria living on your skin that have gotten inside the pod and all that. So it's like you never really left the slime. You're still the slime, just talking about itself.
Okay, let's see. 50%. I believe the latest calculation is that we have as many microbial cells as we have human cells, a human organism, so-called. So 50% of me says, "How dare you call me slime?" That is just an echo of the disdain that we have been inculcated for the microbes. They're incredible. I mean, they started the biosphere, and for something like 2 billion years, it was only microbes, man, and they did not. Well, in fact, they did have crises. We get back to that. Oxygen was an early crisis. So some of the slime, some of these incredibly inventive and responsive organisms figured out photosynthesis. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And because they figured out photosynthesis and pumped oxygen into the atmosphere, that was like the first environmental toxin. And it was death to anaerobes. So the anaerobes, retreated in, animals' guts, went into swampy places and all that to escape the oxygen. But the creation of the oxygen is why all higher forms of life, including Homo sapiens, are possible.
It's funny, to that particular story of crisis and resolution, in the synergy between an oxygen exhaling and a carbon dioxide exhaling metabolism, that's like the new balance that we struck. And there's something in there that seems resonant with this myth that we act on and we carry around, that we're going to survive another crisis with like underground bunkers, and that we're going to burrow and survive. And it looks like the burrow and survive meme has like emerged at least a few different times, like every mass extinction caused by a meteor, obviously. But then it's like, maybe it's actually just like we're carrying around this trauma from the oxygenation event, and our gut bacteria like remember having to go underground to survive. And so we're still, they're sort of controlling our brains somehow. And they're still like, well, how are we gonna do this if our meat suits run away with the game and screw us over again? Anyway, that's a total tangent. I want to wrap this back around to perform itself and enclose this conversation, talking about enclosure. And back to that issue of Biosphere 2 as an enclosed system. If, looking at these gorgeous pictures of the actual building, which is still there in Arizona, although they opened it, right? It looks so much like the futuristic version of the Crystal Palace from the London Exhibition of 1851. And that moment in the history of the modern world is the moment where science says, sort of, we dominate nature. we're gonna put a huge iron and glass structure over this entire park, and the park will be inside the building. And that's the sort of a product of the first industrial revolution, which sort of recreated itself in large with the greenhouse effect, and in a way that itself was a kind of a declaration that we're moving beyond this pre-modern idea of the crystal spheres of, that early kind of cosmology, and into a world where we are the creators and we are doing this thing. But then 100 some years later, Biosphere 2 is singing a very different song about the same kind of work, or like what is superficially a very similar project. When you actually look inside, it's not just this pristine British parkland, but it's this complicated, messy, organic, there was like 5 different biomes represented?
Yeah. And by the way, since we had left the ecotechnic story with, the band of innovators in Santa Fe, I did want to, talk about the progression, because we very early realized that if we only worked in one biome, do we need to explain a biome? Like we kind of know what it is: desert, rainforest, savanna, marine biomes. That in fact, in some of the Russian theorists about the biosphere, really spell this out, that they called biomes the building blocks of the biosphere. And depending on your classification, I think the simplest one might be 15, 30, or even more. And like you were mentioning, Earth's geologic history is pretty wild and turbulent. And, for sure, Heraclitus was right. The only constant is change. Because, and not due to any human malefaction, some geologic eras back, the Amazon was savanna. Then, planetary conditions change, continent. Anyway, so to further what we thought would be a new discipline of ecotechnics, and let's just go back to that. It's not as revolutionary now, perhaps, because every detergent is probably called ecotech and some but the idea back then was, and ecologists have already begun zeroing in on it, is that what was really out of whack on the planet was the whole world of the technosphere. There's another Russian, they're the big thinkers in Biospherics. The technosphere is out of whack with the biosphere, and in fact is harming it. It's there's a book, it came out later, but I love it. It's called Making Peace with the Planet. And that was Eric Commoner, another environmentalist. But we saw very clearly that was the two elements that need to be brought together. And, I was mentioning other sciences, ecological engineering, H.T. Odum and his brother Gene had turned ecology into a systems approach. And H.T. Odum was also the father of ecological engineering. And, ecological engineering, appropriate technology was just starting to raise its eye. Ecotechnics, they were all kind of expressions of, let's figure out how to, in practice and in developing the theory, how do we go into different biomes? So we wanted to have a representative series of projects, including the world ocean. That's when the Heraclitus, the research ship of the Institute, was built, so that we can get hands-on experience in these fundamental building blocks of a biosphere. Now, from the, reverse engineering type thing, if you wanted to have a cadre of people who would have the necessary practical knowledge, would have convened conferences to meet the really leading, engineers, scientists, thinkers, artists, who deal with all of these biomes, and they're faceted. That was kind of the preparatory work of the Institute. So Heraclitus had been operating for a decade and a half. I went to Australia near the end of the 70s to begin one of what was then 2 tropical savanna projects. We have the Puerto Rican rainforest project. So, again, Biosphere 2, to a lot of people, isn't that interesting that these people had the idea that a mini biosphere would have a series of biomes. Well, yeah, except that was, we'd had that insight even before we thought about comparative biospheres and making a new type of laboratory. So
So
that was all preparatory work for it.
how early did this idea for Biosphere 2 actually emerge in this process? And or what was the sort of unifying vision? Because I mean, like you said, you go to visit Synergia Ranch and there are these like tokens, photos and evidence of this extraordinary worldwide network of projects in London and Australia and Ecuador. And like you said, Heraclitus, which I knew about even before I met anyone involved in this. I had a friend go out on the Heraclitus in 2008, which to me still seems like the coolest thing in the entire universe. This converted, like this salvaged Chinese, was it it's a steel-hulled junk, right? And it's been going around on scientific research expeditions since '69. Yeah,
it's salvaged because it probably looked ancient from the day it was finished, but in fact it was built from scratch. And I should actually throw in here, because all of our projects before Biosphere 2 were almost by intention pretty low profile, because they were our laboratories, our laboratory in the rainforest, our laboratory. And the Heraclitus had the idea not only of being a ship, an ocean-going Chinese junk that could visit all the world's oceans, but also we'd create sea people who are really their home is the sea. And there are sea people cultures all over the world. So, all of these projects are very cool. And because, we were a group of mainly pretty young people, just like the NASA engineers in the 60s, how did NASA do Apollo? Well, they had a national commitment, a space race with the Soviets, but I think it's really interesting. People have calculated the average age of a NASA engineer during the 60s was like 25.
Jesus.
And these they weren't worried about making mistakes and being chewed out and losing their job. They were motivated to make history. And I found it really interesting. So at a lot of those conferences, we'd met, a lot of the pioneers and great space people, and they partly, burned the fuse, because they said, look, astronautics we're doing these amazing robotic and manned missions, rocketry is really developed, and we haven't a clue how to live in space. Space support, is really lagging behind. So, and we did our research and we discovered, although they seem to be inaccessible, that the Soviet Union were the leaders at the time. But, it was clear that, hey, why not do this? So, people ascribe different moments. I like the story that one of my crew members, Jane Pointer, tells, that we had a conference in 1982. It was called the Galactic Conference, and we had Bucky Fuller there. And we were already starting to talk about, we had our architect was told to design a spaceship. And because he came back, he came from a wonderful background of working with Frank Lloyd Wright and Bruce Goff, but he came up with an Adobe spaceship. And NASA engineers would have a coronary for sure, because every ounce that you lift off of, but it was kind of an interesting thing. And we had jam sessions. Okay, so the Adobe was a really impractical way of, protecting the orbiting colony or whatever it was from space radiation. But we had jam sessions on how would you create, life support systems in there that were robust, et cetera, et cetera. And, when we looked at the field of space colonies back to that point, Gerard O'Neill, I had the great pleasure of presenting several times at his Princeton Space Studies Institute. But frankly, and I tell him that, his space colonies looked like you took a suburban New Jersey, Main Street and stuck it into space.
And that's still the vision, populating like science fiction movies like Elysium, like that film where all the rich people are living in their sort of like Silicon Valley in the sky, and they're all in these nice sort of, right, open floor plan houses, and it's like, come on.
Well, I know. I mean, there's another digression, but what drives me crazy about sci-fi movies is you've got these huge populations, and they usually never even talk about how they're providing life support. And usually there's not one plant, not even a house plant. around. So magically, apparently, and maybe this is back to the illusion that humans are a complete package. We don't need no stinking ecosystem and local biome or biosphere. We're fine. Just give us a spacesuit and, I don't know, a tube connected to the source of food, water, and oxygen.
It's very 2-year-old trying to get away from their parents kind of an attitude, really. So
back to closure.
Yeah.
So closure is really interesting. If we had been porous, we wouldn't have had what people remember about Biosphere 2. In addition, and we should go back to the beauty of the architecture, is that oxygen mysteriously started disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
And, my colleague who helped invent a lot of the engineering, Bill Dempster, has produced some graphs. And if we were leaking like NASA facilities do, we literally would not have seen that we were losing oxygen because it was happening very, very slowly. We were losing like 0.25% of oxygen per month. And, air exchange, Biosphere 2 was a marvel on many levels, but the engineering, it was like the NASA engineers, as we got this group of people, including some of our own people, and we set them impossible goals. Here's this 3-acre, 75-foot ceilings in the rainforest, for example, glass structure sitting under the Arizona sun where it'll get 110 and it'll get below freezing. We had snow outside Biosphere. And how do you make that thing virtually airtight? That was just the beginning of it. So I always like to say, and there's a whole segment in that Pushing Our Limits about it, the first rebellion at Biosphere 2 is the engineers looked at the architecture plans and they said, this is nuts, man. This is going to be so difficult to build and it's going to cost so much more. Why don't you just do a big box store? So, just imagine that timeline if we had agreed. So we're going to build a first human-made, first designed biosphere, and it's going to look like a Walmart. Would that fight? I can't imagine.
It doesn't really stir the imagination.
Yeah, exactly. And so the architects, and this is Margaret Augustine and Phil Hawes, and 20 or 30 people, computer graphics and whatnot. But they basically made Biosphere 2 an homage to world architecture, from the Babylonian vaults that covered the agricultural system to the step pyramids, from Egypt and Mesoamerica to the geodesic domes that cover the lungs. So
the lungs, by the way, I think it's worth making a side note about this because I got to go on a tour of the sort of laboratory microbiosphere setup, and I think it's worth explaining to people how you were able to keep that air pressure and Freddie's work and all that.
Okay, it's actually a good segue about the number of amazing engineering challenges we set our engineers. So if you can actually make, and this took a huge investment, a number of failed attempts, you can figure out how to make this huge structure virtually airtight. The consequence is, inside, we're basically temperate to tropical, rainforest, fog desert from Baja, etc. We're going to have a different pressure inside Biosphere 2 than the outside. As I was saying, it's just the high mountain desert of Arizona. So a structure that flimsy, and we needed to have it glass because we wanted to be, basically it was powered, the plants were powered by sunlight. That would mean that system would implode when the air pressure was less inside than outside and explode. So to compensate for that, we'd either have to, make the outer structure, the skin of Biosphere 2, so strong that it would have increased the price immeasurably, and it would have reduced the sunlight in. So again, out of the box kind of thinking, this is Bill Dempster's genius. One of the solution he came up with is we had these two massive air ducts that went to structures that had a rubber membrane on a steel frame, and they were in a chamber, covered by the geodesic dome, but the geodesic dome wasn't the lung, that could rise when the pressure inside needed to expand the air and could go down. And each one of those membranes, if memory serves me right, was more than 10 tons. So daily you could see in Biosphere 2 the power of air, because that would go up and down 15 to 20 feet between day and night. So brilliant thing. And so because those chambers, the variable chambers, were kind of like a bellows, or, they would go up and down, they came to be called lungs, but it's a misleading term because the human lungs, in fact, bring in outside air. Right. These enable the pressure differences to not explode or implode the Biosphere 2 itself.
More like the swim bladder in a fish, kind of.
Yeah.
And there's something about that that you talk about, the convergence or the sort of reconciliation of the biosphere and technosphere. And there's another visionary architectural project in Arizona, right? Arcosanti, which also looked at how do you build a city, how do you build a structure that is operating as a single organism. And I think it's just worth noting that it seems as though that the line of thinking here is living buildings, that the technologies are themselves somehow alive, if only sort of metaphorically, like if only like loosely, like we're calling it lungs.
I think Arcosanti was also impelled by the idea that to counteract suburban sprawl, let's build was that going to be a half a mile or a mile high? I mean, a number of architects have come up with that idea, and I understand, although personally I'm not sure I really want to live in a giant ant mound. But it's worth saying, because and in fact, Paolo Soleri became a really good friend, still is a friend of the Institute, and Biosphere 2, he got John Allen up to, I think he was having genius seminars and workshops. But I actually want to go back a bit further to what you're saying, because it ties into, because we knew of the work of Vernadsky, and that's a kind of a complicated story.
Vernadsky is the guy who invented the term noosphere, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Vernadsky didn't invent the word biosphere, although that was only done in the 1880s. That late, there wasn't a word for the sphere of life. But Vernadsky invented the science of biogeochemistry, and he studied rocks and life around the planet, and totally revolutionized our understanding that, life, when I was growing up in school, I think they would literally say that life is a really lucky passenger on planet Earth. Isn't it marvelous that life happened to find this vacant, planet that had conditions that were conducive to life? Now, what Vernadsky demonstrated, and his successors, he started many schools in Russia, was that life transforms the planet. And in fact, when we look out, we're looking at the byproducts of life. And even a lot of them, what used to be thought of as mineral deposits, these huge deposits of iron, for example, used to be considered to be natural formations, i.e. geologic ones. No, in fact, those slime that you were so cruelly making fun of.
Oh, I don't have a problem with slime.
Well, okay. All right.
I'm trying to reclaim the word.
True. Okay, I'll hear it as juicy. Juicy with fertility and fecundity. And
Exactly. The return of the Black Madonna into...
Yeah, there you go. There's a good myth. And by the way, in Pushing Our Limits, it's kind of written at a popular science thing. And I wanted to do several things there, by the way. I know this is not depression. We're going to get back to the noosphere.
We can take a nonlinear path.
I wanted to pull together really all of the historical context, the science, what it was really designed for, what we learned, and then to look at the implications for, as I say, our current assault on our global biosphere, which, has become front and center, front page news, and it wasn't that way 30 years ago when we were designing Biosphere 2. and also digest the experience. And, there's a few chapters in there, yeah, both about, I think it's gotten way too much play, the group dynamic tensions. That's to be expected. And in fact, if you're honest about your extended family, your workplace, any human group, I've never seen a human group, including ecotechnic groups. I mean, we have dysfunction, just it abounds. It's just part of the human ecology. But the thing is that, like in Biosphere 2, if you have a group of people with all of their warts and personality conflicts and dysfunction who can see a unifying purpose, and I think that's what held the biospherians together. So there's to my mind, the more unexpected was that we didn't sabotage the biosphere and each other out of sheer subconscious, hatred or whatever, the pressures of being in the media eye and having a power struggle. And then I have a chapter on this awesome experience. I shouldn't say it was unexpected, because I had 24 hours in our test module that gave me a taste of it. But that amazing experience of viscerally, organically feeling so connected to the biosphere. So there was a lot of reasons, and I also very much wanted that book to speak to artists and myth makers and musicians, because I think we need a whole new generation of creative people to give us the storylines for new outcomes. I kind of borrow from William Burroughs, who was a wonderful, friend to the project and to ecotechnics. And he said, we need a mythology that's appropriate to the space age. And he further said that we're going to judge heroes and villains by their intentions towards the planet. So I think, in addition to all the science and being creative in, which way you've got gifts, we have a desperate need of new storylines, new artistic expressions, new myths to be forged through the arts. And to me, that's very much like if you look back at Native American and indigenous cultures, the famous pagans that get such a bad name, they almost get as bad a name as slime mold. But, all of those cultures were so much in contact with the earth that it was second nature that they ascribed godlike powers, Mother Nature. The powers of nature were really revered and respected. And I think that is also part of the equation of how we get to more optimistic futures.
So this is a really good point to bend into the topic you foreshadowed earlier about the role of drama and theater in mission crews, in like social cohesion, and as well as in sort of the complete human experience that includes science and all this other stuff. And I'm, both as looking forward into the future of multiplying biospheres and how we're going to have to rethink how we are in relationship, but then also just sort of speaking to, because I'm not as familiar as I'd like to be, but I know that John Allen has this very rich and deep and complex perspective on how drama is involved in this, and that it remains a very active part of the daily lives of everyone at the ranch. And so I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Yeah, I'm working on another book, kind of a memoir, and every time I get to that story about the 3 lines of work, I have to laugh, because frankly, I didn't think I was a theater type. I wasn't a theater major. I mean, my parents dragged me too, and I would always seek out really great theater. So I kind of approached it. I figured, well, I can, I'll put up with it because everything else seems so interesting. And the more, of course, we were having a very kind of a unique blend. Again, a synergy. Synergy, by the way, for your audience, we didn't define. That's the word that gives Synergia Ranch its name. Synergy, and it's a word that existed before, but Bucky Fuller really popularized it. A synergy is something where the sum of the parts is less than the totality. And in fact, the sum of the parts do not even predict the properties of the totality. So it's important. So in a way, our theater was a synergy because we drew from Asian dance drama. We drew from Artaud, Brecht, Stanislavski, the European avant-garde. And the deeper I got into theater, and, we did a mix of doing in fresh translations, classic works and kind of new ones that John was an anonymous author, but sometimes it was improvisational theater, because every one of our projects had its own studio theater. And when I lived in the Outback, it was part of the magic. It was really difficult. It was, Crocodile Dundee, but not on a glossy, movie screen. It was kind of, you're thrust in there, it was pretty wild. And so we naturally turned, because life was full of threat and peril and difficulty, to making these really hallucinogenic Outback comedies. And the wonderful thing about theater is that, as Bresh said, a theater without an audience is a fiction, it wouldn't mean anything. So we would take our productions, and we were part of the local town's, annual festival. We'd go to Aboriginal camps and put them on, and had the great honor on more than one occasion of the Aboriginal audience spontaneously getting up and doing a corroboree. Okay, you've shown us your theater, here's ours, or to mining camps, etc. And everybody gets, theater is a wonderful medium, especially if you're incorporating a lot of gesture and dance. For example, the Heraclitus, when it went down the Amazon, did a original play called something like this, the Dance of the Seven Deadly Sins. And they did it without, the lust, sloth, gluttony, all the good ones, all the great standard emotions. But they did that play for Indian audiences and town audiences without words. And it was a great checkout. A lot of these indigenous people have seen good talking, Westerners come, and next thing you know, they've ripped you off, made you into slaves, and taken your, So theater also reveals being. So I became it became one of my most favorite things, actually. And we had a touring company for many years, Theater of All Possibilities, that used to do tours in the United States. We had a touring bus. We're all living on very little means. I think we didn't fully sound out why we built the Heraclitus in the way that we did. But we'd sleep in the back of the theater and, camp out in the bus, and we had a kitchen on board. But I began to get this real sense that, in fact, we are all, Shakespeare said it best, all the world's a stage, and we have many roles to play. So, when you start to really get into the metaphysics and the reality of theater, Michael, you're playing podcast host. I'm playing, semi-famous guy who did interesting, that's, giving an interview. We play all these roles. And the point being, so there's something that's called in-life theater. And in fact, I was really amused. I mean, I think Biosphere 2, we used to minimize how radical and revolutionary it is. So now I feel totally free to emphasize it. And I remember, in the negative media stories was, these aren't scientists, these are recycled actors from New Mexico. Well, Biosphere 2 was an in-life production. So yeah, I mean, we could have made a Walmart. That would have been really a different experience to be inside of for 2 years, I'll tell you. Or we could have not had the jumpsuits that I hear people, but we only use those jumpsuits when there were a lot of photographers around. When we went out, doing our 3 or 4 hours in the agriculture, we didn't have those pretty jumpsuits on, I'll tell you. But, a certain amount of theater, we are involved in it. I mean, I play a role as the partner to my girlfriend, to the father to my sons. We play many roles in life. So what I began to appreciate was theater is a means of getting some distance and understanding the dramas that you're in, the roles you're playing, with an idea, again, nothing is fixed in life. Maybe I could pick better dramas. Maybe I could pick more interesting plots. Maybe, I'm playing the same stupid role because I'm socially conditioned to do it. For example, I grew up in a Jewish family. I can play really well the studious intellectual. And I'm not really an intellectual. I mean, I don't, thinking is hard. But pretending to think, I can do that really well. That was, the price of admission to my family. All the boys become professionals and doctors. Yeah, so the point about theater is it's very profound. And, so you can use it, and I love theater actually on a stage, but there is a certain reality to, it is the human drama, it's the human comedy, it's the human epic, it's the human melodrama. It's the human, mystery drama where you're condemned to starve in the midst of plenty. And there's another really deep one, which I think, goes back to mindfulness, which is now the buzzword of the moment.
Right.
How great is that people are using words like sustainability and mindfulness? But there's a certain very fundamental thing. An actor acts. So he learns to use his organism. He, improves his, not gymnast and not Olympic athlete, but to use your body to express. He learns to, be able to work with and let loose his emotions. He learns voice and how to deliver a speech and be coherent and do that on your feet at the drop of a hat, literally, in an acting class. So in a certain sense, and you can apply this in my life, how much today have I been an actor and how much the opposite of an actor is a reactor? And again, I think great nature, we're put here. I think we have enormous potential, but really nature just wants us maybe to not destroy the biosphere and create some offspring. But there's so much more that you can do. So this whole acting thing is very profound. And almost every acting tradition has this idea, too, that you leave your baggage, you leave your everyday social personality at the door, and you step into a magic space where I can become, I played Horatio in Hamlet. Maybe someday I could actually play Hamlet, but so you can take on roles. Yeah, I have some friends who say Biosphere 2 was John Allen's greatest theater production, and in a way that, if it's used dismissively, it's not true, but in a way it was. And we didn't realize, we really thought that was going to be a quiet research facility. We'd make back the private investment by selling it to Disney or Tokyo or London, where, gazillions of people would come to see, this marvel and interesting laboratory.
There's two things there. One is that it seems there's a functional utility about stepping outside of yourself when you're locked in a box with 7 other people for 2 years, right? Or like that you're on the Mars mission or whatever. That kind of proximity, the tightness of that social molecule tends to like reify people's identities and attachments. How did you find yourselves using theater as a practice while living in Biosphere 2? Like obviously it seems like it's woven into the whole life, but how is it helping with the interpersonal frictions that came with that kind of close quarters existence?
Well, I think that everybody had, worked in theater. Virtually the entire first crew, were recruited from people who had, done well at ecotechnic projects. We also sent, it was an important part of the training, we sent everyone to either the Heraclitus and or the Outback, the Australian tropical savanna projects, because both of them really isolated tropical conditions. That's where the Heraclitus was in tropical waters then. Small group, real time. This is not a practice. This is cutting edge, real time ecological management. And I think that was invaluable. We also trained, and it was part of the arsenal, not just from theater, but we had studied group dynamics and ways of dealing with it. And, so we had, I think that, to everyone's credit, all 8 of us were super committed to the project. And even when there were frictions about, say, strategy and what should be prioritized, the fact that everyone, respected each other and understood that if we sabotaged Biosphere 2, we literally could be endangering ourselves. But we also periodically spoke about these, what was happening in group dynamics. We did exercises like passing the talking stick, or, we had a series of rereading a key book, Biomes, Experiences in Groups, that I recommend to all your readers. It's still in print, which really details the difference between a task group, a work group, that's working intelligently, cooperatively towards shared goals, and what he calls the group animal, which are subconscious things that have attractive titles like kill the leader, dependency, fight or flight, or pairing. And, so the fact that we had put these into practice in our previous work at ecotechnic projects, but we use those tools inside Biosphere too. And the big thing is, even doing those periodic, we're not going to solve the tensions, but we are going to put it all out on the table. So subconsciously, because I have a friction with that group of people or with that person, I'm not going to let the subconscious agenda, which has destroyed many, many expeditions and great endeavors, let me tell you. It's actually called explorer's cholera. And it starts with cabin fever, and I think we all know this, right? There was a North Pole explorer that was talking about, watching somebody chew his rice like 20 times. He had a little, nutrition trip that he was doing, drove other people to near homicide. That's just cabin fever. So yeah, you have all of that. And, so periodically we would have parties and we would have dinners in special places. We, assiduously celebrated every holiday with a feast, and we all agreed, even though we were food limited and calorie restricted, that was the diet, let's put some food aside so we can have the immense pleasure of having a day off and this incredible table of food, and come as different characters. So this is the thing too, And in fact, I think it was the most profound, and I had done group therapy and some individual, psychoanalysis type stuff, is I had to live with myself for 2 years. And so early on, I was the first one, and I know all my colleagues will agree, I'm so grouchy in the morning. But the thing is, you guys only have to put up with it when we have our meetings and we're working. I have to live with myself 24/7. So I took that experience as, in fact, I had 7 mirrors, and you learn to, we all know this from our friendships and families, you learn where all the buttons are. So we would have these, sometimes it would turn into kind of a game where we'd just go around the table and people would push other people's buttons to see them react. So in a way, it was an incredibly intense experience if you were motivated to look at your behavior and change it.
Huh. Yeah, I think about, I was talking with Kate Green last week, who I think you were on a panel with her, weren't you?
Yeah,
at Interplanetary Fest?
Yeah.
And both of you have not identical, but somewhat similar experiences in that she inhabited an experimental mock-up for like a Mars colony. Yeah. And we were talking about all of the things that you'd want to bring with you, all the things that you sort of take for granted on Earth that you would miss in space. Like one of the things was essential oils. It's like all of the specific fragrances that we take for granted that would like trigger memories, and I feel like listening to this, the arts, and like specifically theater as a way of escaping the person that you're stuck being at 7 a.m. That there's something about, it's not just that we have to enclose branch, divide, and reproduce the biosphere in order to make it out into this ostensible cosmic destiny, but that we also have to enclose and multiply and differentiate the ego itself, and that there's something about adult psychological development. Robert Keegan talks about this in his book In Over Our Heads, The Mental Demands of Modern Life, that simply living in the modern world, we have to move from social group to group, setting to setting, and we have to move through different personae in order to do that. Like that you in order to live in the modern world, you have to be a different person at work than you are at church, than you are at home with your family. So it seems as though something that we will, when I look forward into what the future human being will be like, I think part of it seems to be that each person will have a plural identity. That much like there's the one glass enclosure that contains all of the 5 biomes, right? That, my hypnotherapist friend tells me that each of us have something like 7 to 12 sub-personality modules, and that we just don't notice. And it gets back to that whole piece of the relationship between mindfulness and sustainability, like not running your car in the same gear all the time, that there's a sort of like hydrogeology of the self. I don't know if this is a dead end, but I feel like there's something in there.
No, that's a really good point. It kind of triggered in me, and I wanted to say, we were also very aware of that NASA had followed a certain template. Let's just pick, test pilots because we know that, they're at a certain physical level, they're top of their game and all that stuff. And for some reason in that culture, of course, and I think NASA was totally on board, the less emotions you show, the better off we are. So we were kind of the opposite. And of course, Rusty Schweikert, who, was a good friend and was on the project review committee, he was on one of the Apollo missions. I think they did the first spacewalks, etc. But, in fact, I virtually opened Pushing Our Limits with a quote from him, that when he went out on his spacewalk and there was a temporary technical glitch, and for astronauts having like 60 seconds or something without a program of what they have to do is pretty rare and treasured. So here he is out there on a tether, orbiting the Earth at, 18,000 miles an hour. And he's looking at this Earth spinning down. And he went into this wonderful reverie that, it wasn't because he was a good student and he had good karma. And, he was kind of lucky to be in that position. And he really saw himself as a sensing element for humanity. And I've had the great, pleasure of meeting quite a number of astronauts and cosmonauts, since we did a lot of work and trips to the Soviet Union. And they're all changed men. Something in that experience, and it's, unfortunately, it's only, 100 people or whatever it is now, who've actually lifted off and lived outside the Earth's biosphere and seen our planet from space. That is very, very profound. So we didn't know really what the biospherian experience was going to be, but, it was kind of like part of we were encouraged. And I think everyone was so, I think we were all in love with Biosphere 2 and through Biosphere 2, even more in love with our Earth's biosphere, since it was a tiny little offspring, of it. So we were totally encouraged. And I think it's the only time in my life I've written poetry on a regular basis, kept journals. People did music incorporating natural and technical sounds in Biosphere 2, did film pieces. Our manager of the food system, some of her art, and we had art fairs or festivals. We had art festivals, and of course we had the hubris to call them the first and second inter-biospheric one. So we linked up through really primitive, we're talking 92 and 93, to the Electronic Cafe in Santa Monica and similar things like that. And just by link outside on the campus of Biosphere 2, outside artists would present their poetry and music and dance, and we would do it as well. And again, thinking about it, I think that's as intrinsic to humans as anything else that we do, celebrating our world. I mean, there's so many traditions around the world. It's one of the wonderful things about the, planetary dialogue that's just incipiently beginning, is that we're all pretty amazing people and individuals, and we come from such unique and increasingly hybrid cultures, So, to celebrate our world, that's another role that I think artists have to play. So we play many roles. So, I mean, neither would I call myself a scientist, although now I have a PhD, nor would I call myself an artist, but I wouldn't say that I'm not that. It's just like that, that feeling I had, theater is all well and good, but I'm not, I wasn't the kind of guy who went to the drama department and, rehearsed for plays, but we all have that potentiality. And I have to say, in ecotechnics, what I really appreciate is that we very deliberately, the theater was called Theater of All Possibilities. We had a micro loan program called enterprise for developing potentiality. But when I talk to young people, especially, our culture, I think, and it may have a malicious intent in doing so, tends to diminish people's expectations of what they personally can do. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't need to be world shattering, but it, as you were pointing out very beautifully, we all do have all of these different personas and roles that we can play. What I was talking about in theater is, you should consciously develop those. I mean, that's kind of the raw material. So ideally, if you have 6 people on a space station orbiting the, maybe if they each have 8 or 9 distinctly different personalities, you could have a lot of different parties with different configurations. Why not? By the way, since we're informationally open, unlike Kate, and I think they had even the 15 minutes or whatever it was, a time lag from Mars, we really wanted that life to be as normal as possible. So one of the perks, just like cosmonauts, we could pick up the phone, call anyone, and, especially when we're headline news, you say, I'm calling you from Biosphere 2, you'd blow right through secretaries. Lickety split. But we really wanted, and it's a pity that the internet was so undeveloped, because one, we could have directly, not having to rely on talk radio or media, interface with the hundreds of millions of people who followed Biosphere 2.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. Future Fossils is part of the MindPod network, along with Third Eye Drops, the Astral Hustle, Synchronicity Podcast, and an oodle of other fascinating programs. I encourage you to go to mindpodnetwork.com and subscribe to them all. And stay tuned, because we have some awesome episodes coming up on Future Fossils. But for now, may your now be exquisite, long, and wonderful. I was actually, I'm going to ask you that earlier in this conversation. You talked about what a surprise the amount of media attention that you received was. And I'm curious, what do you think it was? Because it's always something in the zeitgeist, right? There's like a receptivity or a sensitivity. And we're at the early 90s, and there's Captain Planet, and like it's the first time people are talking about the importance of recycling. And I think it's worth mentioning, just as an aside, that you also wrote a book called The Wastewater Gardener. And that that since this whole thing, that there's another act. But yeah, so what do you think it was that...
Well, I think it touched a nerve around the planet. I mean, and I always like to point out, so people said, and it almost became sort of a standing joke, that Biosphere 2 is 50 years ahead of its time. But the reality was that, the operating of a managing company was called Space Biospheres Ventures. Mm-hmm. And when I say